Hi everyone, I'm Ali Thomas, Environmental Health Content Specialist for RHE, and I'm here today with my colleague Jeremy Manners, Chief Editor of REAMS, and our guest Paul Oatt. We're recording this session as a follow-up to our last Housing Roundtable on the 23rd of September. So if you're watching this session and you've not seen the roundtable itself yet, it will be really useful context to go and watch the roundtable first. So you can access that recording via our YouTube channel or in the housing professionals area of REAMS communities. In that roundtable, experienced EHO Paul Oatt delivered a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation around his PhD research in responding to the local authority private sector housing regulatory knowledge and skills shortage to deliver better enforcement. Paul, thanks for joining us again today.
My pleasure, thank you.
There was quite a lot of discussion, comments and questions that we didn't really have time to cover in that roundtable session. We had 250 people attend that session and 60% of the audience were officers with over 10 years experience. And in the chat for that session, there was a real sense that the heart of your research is an issue that really matters to people working in PRS regulation. One of the questions we asked the audience was, what's the biggest challenge in housing enforcement for you? And the answers repeatedly said, resources, funding, training, staffing, recruitment, knowledge, time, conflicting priorities, and that certainly reflects some of the key themes that you discussed in your presentation. So we're just going to dive into some of those issues in a little bit more depth. So I wanted to start off with a couple of questions about your research.
Okay.
Towards the beginning of your presentation, you made an interesting comment about dissatisfaction from tenants with housing enforcement services. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on why that might be, and if there was anything we could do to improve expectations.
Yeah, I mean, at the root of it is, I think, literally unrealistic expectations. And they can be fueled by Googling and trying to make the online facts fit your own situation. Not to say that there are not times when they actually do, but the classic one, of course, is damp and mold, and everyone is understandably concerned about mold. But the problem for officers who inspect it is that we go to a property and we can see structurally that there are things a landlord can do to remedy, and we then have something that we can do to improve the situation. But if all of those things have already been done, we then have to ask how the occupier is managing condensation. You know, the previous government said it's wrong for landlords to blame tenants' lifestyle. And I think that's right, but they should have qualified it by saying it's wrong for landlords to blame damp and mold on tenants' lifestyle just so they can get out of doing remedial works. I think that would have been a better way to express it. But you know, if occupiers not if they're not following advice on how to manage it, on how to heat and how to ventilate, which is always a very hard sell for us to, you know, with tenants. You know, if the property's got extractors, it's got trickle vents, but they're not being used, they're all shut off. If it's got a good heating system, if it's got you know, insulation and, you know, and everything's fine, then you've got to think, well, perhaps the landlord might have a point if he's talking about lifestyle at that point, you know, and that's the reality. You know, it's wrong to unfairly blame tenants, but if we do our risk assessments properly and we inspect every aspect, and that's our conclusion, then that's really where we have to take it, I suppose. I mean, they also have a point when their workmen are refused access. And the officers had just heard the tenants say they're not interested in repairs, they just want to get moved. And in the meantime, local authorities are doing things like they're triaging cases, they're prioritising damp and mould. And so we have to try to manage that expectation, often for tenants, you know, that we ask them to follow advice and then come back to us if there are still issues. And so there's a lot going on. It's not just as simple as just saying you know, you can't blame the tenant's lifestyle. There are many different factors to it. Yes, a lot of the time it is the landlord not wanting to do the repairs, but the other time, you know, as well on top of that, you've also got to manage the tenant's expectations as well. So the other thing is that what came out of the interviews a lot is that a lot of tenants have discovered that if they then complain to their MP or councillor, their case will get reopened again. And so they kind of try to circumvent the triaging that's going on and the prioritization of the more serious cases. And so that's undermining the work. And that's one of the criticisms from officers, is that managers don't do enough to manage the expectations of local councillors. And they've essentially they've got a layperson's view of local authority functions, and they're expecting quick fixes. But housing legislation being the way it is, there is no quick fix for these things. Sometimes they're wanting a 5-day response or an 8-day response, and sometimes it takes that long for an officer to be able to contact the tenants and organise an inspection. So we haven't got an answer for them yet. So it's managing all of that is quite important. And sometimes you hear local authorities say, yeah, well, we've done things, we take the councillor out on visits, and that they start to understand things. But then an election comes and they disappear, and you've got another one to come along. So you've got to sustain that. It's not just good enough to say, okay, we did that last year, and that's fine now, we've done that. Sometimes these things need to be sustained. So I mean, and when I spoke to managers, I interviewed some managers and I asked them about their influence over policy. A lot of them feel they have very little influence. Some of them, it's different wherever you go, whichever local authority. Some local authorities with very strong enforcement outputs say that that trumps everything else. We've got this very strong approach, and that trumps all of these other things that try to undermine. And councillors will get very robust responses. So it really depends on how you as department managers, and that's one of the things I think my research is really trying to ignite amongst us, how we can be more vocal, how encouraging a better conversation about that. So in a local authority recently, I created a short online course on damp and mould, and it was intended for other types of council workers who go and visit homes, health and social care people. So just to be able so they could distinguish between rising damp, penetrating damp, or condensation, and then to understand when to advise tenants and when to refer them to private sector housing for intervention. And it's been well received, but we need to sort of exert influence and sustain it. And it needs to be, with churn of staff and change of managers and everything, you need to keep highlighting that you've got these things available. Otherwise, they just get lost in the ether. They get lost with everything else. So it's improved stuff. But then, of course, you've got also, you can also bring this to councillors and portfolio holders. But you've got to be aware that they change, and as soon as they change, you've got to keep in step. I think was there a question about competing legislation as well? Was that part of it?
Yeah, is that part of the kind of I guess confusion in terms of their dissatisfaction? Is it quite hard then for tenants to understand exactly what it is that they're entitled to, and what they should expect?
Yeah, I think it is, depending on where they're getting their information from. That's one of the keys to it. I mean, competing legislation is quite an interesting one, because we, as officers now, we're getting more legislation put on top of the rest of it, and sometimes I think for newer officers, your job really is to go out and inspect, find out what's wrong, and then you've got to marry that up with the legislation and with your housing enforcement policy and find the right way to go forward. And the more stuff legislation you give them, that the more difficult it can be. You've also got the other thing where now the other thing is that tenants have got is that they can go to housing disrepair legal advisors and get for no win, no fee.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can take those cases on. And to a certain extent, we're hearing quite a lot from local authorities that reactive complaints have dwindled. And one of the reasons we always say reactive complaints have dwindled because of fear of retaliatory eviction. And that's probably true. But another reason why they're dwindling is because now tenants are finding other ways to circumvent this triaging effect that we've had. Interestingly, what one officer said, who has their own business, who's a professional. And works sometimes for some as a professional for some of these housing disrepair lawyers, often gets cases where that he needs to refer to a local authority, and then he gets caught up in this automation that we've got now with councils, which is creating a problem with invisibility. So he can't speak to a human being. He can't speak to a fellow EHO and say, I need to refer this case to you because of whatever it might be. And so it's very difficult. And then he just made the comparison that if he's got a problem with his Xbox, he can contact Microsoft and you'll get a response within 24 hours. And and local authorities their responses now are something like 5 days, or maybe 5 working days before they'll get back to somebody. And it's becoming more difficult in some authorities. In other authorities, when I ask people about this, it's pretty much instantaneous. There are still people who have real people on the end of the phone who will answer calls and will manage them, but other people have got these triaging systems in place, and they're done for a reason. They're done because of the volume of calls that we're getting, and to be able to prioritize and understand all of that. But also it's creating a bit of a distance between some of the people that we want to deal with, and if they're vulnerable, then that can also be a bit of a turn off for them as well.
Is it okay if I just come in, Ali, on that?
Go for it.
I was just thinking on what you were saying, Paul, and I think with local government reorganisation and more councils going to bigger unitaries, I think that's probably going to happen more and more, where it is going to be more challenging for customers, especially vulnerable people, to actually get through to local authorities because of the measures they've put in place. Purely for cost saving measures. And I think your comments as well about the fragmentation of the legislation. I mean, it's hard for officers to know which bit of legislation to enforce, and it's hard for tenants, it's hard for landlords. And if you're a tenant, I think, who's potentially got the option to get some compensation, well, that might be the avenue you're going to go down rather than the enforcement route.
Yeah.
I think so. I was delivering some training recently over the last few weeks to registered providers, and they're seeing a lot more no-win, no-fee solicitors as well. And actually, something that you mentioned when you were talking there was about access, and actually sometimes the no-win, no-fee solicitors are actually advising not to let landlords in to do the works because it will increase the amount of compensation because they're being exposed for longer, or the conditions are ongoing for longer. So I think it depends on the quality of the no-win, no-fee solicitor.
I mean, that's unethical, isn't it? I think that's possibly something that you could potentially report a solicitor to the bar for. Really, I would have thought.
Yeah,
terrible.
I think that's it as well, isn't it? If you've got somebody knocking on your door saying, "Oh, if you've got some disrepair issues, we can get you some compensation," then that's that's a face they can talk to straight away, rather than to get through to the council and potentially wait 3 to 5 days for a response.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it is social media. They use social media a lot for it as well, and maybe that's something we need to get better at doing as well.
I've seen an advert on social media recently asking me if I've got mold in my home and I want to speak to someone about it. So it definitely happens. And actually, maybe in terms of expectations for tenants, I've seen some discussions on social media where people are getting poor advice from other people who aren't necessarily experts themselves because they're creating a discussion on social media. One of the things you mentioned there, Paul, was automation. So kind of moving that on a step. Where can we use digital tools maybe to assist in delivery? Is that something you explored in your research, how we could use them?
So I sort of explored it in a roundabout way, not directly. It's something that came out of the interviews, because officers actually spoke about the accessibility of their own council websites. Some, not all of them, said that they're not very user-friendly. Depending on where a member of the public lands on the site and tries to navigate to what they need to find, it can be quite difficult. And I started looking at some local authority websites because that just got me thinking. And the one that I was doing some work with recently was very difficult. You know, I just kept well, what would just trying to think, what would a tenant want to know about? Let's put damp and mold into it. What comes up, you know? And it just didn't take you to where perhaps you needed to go if you didn't know. You know, obviously, obviously I'd know that if I really wanted to, I'd go private sector housing and then look and navigate from there. But not people might not necessarily know that. They just got, I've got a problem with mice. I've got a problem with damp and mold. I've got whatever it, or my heat's not, my gas boiler's not working, whatever it might be. And if we don't have, the AI, I think, for our websites needs a bit of work. And also perhaps some of the things I've noticed, like, for instance, Eco4 and stuff like that, it's lives in a different part of the local authority's makeup structure. So so if you go to the benefits section, for example, it'll start telling there'll be sections on there on how you can apply for things like under the Eco4, a tenant can, with the agreement of the landlord, and get things done in the property. And so that was there, but you won't find a link to that from private sector housing sometimes. So it all, and in other local authorities will probably listening to this, probably say, oh yeah, but we do. Yeah, you probably do, but not everybody does. And that's one of the difficulties with the research is, we're generalizing, but people are in different situations across the country. So one of the other things that we discussed in regard to technology is how it's changed the nature of our jobs since COVID. So the relationship between the area we regulate, the office, and working from home. And so you get different opinions from officers who joined post-pandemic or during COVID compared to people who've been in local government a long time and they've experienced all the changes. So, and it also depends on what job you do and what level you're at and how much you need to interact with other departments. So for those who, pre-pandemic officers, and they've been doing it for a long time, recalled being able to just go to other departments and go and speak to people they knew they knew their names, that they knew where to find them, what desks they were sitting at, and they wanted to get some information straight away, or exchange, or tell them something, and they'd get that information straight away. But now it's all been done by email, and so to them this is a lot slower, and they find that difficult. But officers who joined post-pandemic or during the pandemic are just used to working remotely. And so they don't have that thing to compare it to. So that's just the way it is. And they adapt. And they're quite happy just dropping into the office once a week. And we all, I think on the one hand, we all accept the convenience of being able to balance our work around our lives. We can do that. But in the long term, one of the long-term views is that local government over many years has seen services increasingly reorganized and fragmented with silo working, and technology has created basically a new iteration of it, which we're very unlikely to come back from. But and we could probably recall as well, many of us, that when we started in the job, we were shadowing people. You'd be in the office and an experienced officer would probably approach you out of the blue and say, I'm going out and, we're going to have a look at a case. This might interest you. Do you want to come? And you'd go out and get some experience because it was spontaneous and you were in the right place at the right time and you got that opportunity. But now those opportunities for some of the newer officers aren't actually there, and it's more difficult to coordinate these things. So there is an argument that the way we work now exacerbates the invisibility of the profession. But there's also an argument, of course, for work-life balance. And it's a wider conversation to be had. It might just be thinking about how better to manage keeping us all together when we work remotely, but then we've always been in the situation where a lot of the work we do is outside of the office because of the nature of our job. So coming back to the office after you've done an inspection is really that time when you perhaps need to be alone anyway and do your HHSRS calculations or decide what notice you're going to serve or whatever. So that's okay, but there are times when you need to be together. So it's kind of working out how we now sort of work these things around, and also consider I suppose across the spectrum, the newer people that we want to encourage and we want to nurture, and the older people as well, and just trying to coordinate it better, I suppose. But yeah, it's not, there's no easy answers, but I think there's a wider conversation to be had now, particularly now that we seem to be, we're at the other end. There's still COVID around, but we're kind of at the other end of it now. So we should be starting to think about how we can reorganize.
I think that's really interesting that you're bringing working from home into that in terms of the how that impacts on newer officers. Because there is that kind of they're not getting the same experience passed on to them, which probably brings us on quite nicely to think about training. What are we going to do for these people? One of the challenges that was raised in the roundtable was around local authorities managing to train officers, and that training might be cost prohibitive for them, that they're struggling to fund training, there's not enough budget for training, there's no budget for CPD and for CIEH membership. And I think actually mentioned in your presentation that was identified back in 2020 by the CIEH workplace survey. But 5 years on, we're still in a very similar position. How do we kind of do something to counteract that challenge around training and professionalism of new and existing officers?
Yeah, it's not. It's the training is a real problem. We need to value, I think, young people coming into this world of housing and environmental health generally, I suppose, and we really need to support them. And I always think when I run a course and I've got the students in front of me, I mean, you've got to think that some of them are potentially tomorrow's team leaders, managers, directors, heads of service, one day maybe, and we need to equip them with everything they need to fill those roles. So investment in staff training is not where we should be cutting in the long term. I mean, it just creates more problems for local authorities when they don't have the skills in-house to tackle the complicated issues that officers encounter, because then you start having to buy that in, through agencies, and then that becomes cost prohibitive as well, because that's a lot of money. And I've worked as a contractor. I've given it my all, and I've given value for money, but it is a lot, and I do understand, I do get it, and obviously, after a while, they have to say, we can't do this anymore. Really sorry, but the whole reason you're there is because they don't have anybody else, and so because they've not invested in that. So we really have to think about it's the investment side of it is a really important thing. I think local authorities get that wrong a lot when we're looking at cost cutting. I remember in one local authority, I think this was during the time of the I think Cameron Clegg government, that coalition government, and they started announcing austerity. We got into the office one day and there's a padlock on the stationery cupboard. And the padlock's on the stationery cupboard because that's going to solve all the problems. Don't stop wasting and using paper too much and go electronically. And you think, well, that's really not going to help, because I need to print notices, I need to serve notices, I need to get people to do things. So, I need access to paper, people. Sorry, but it's just very, very strange. And we have to think about how. I think we have to think about the opportunity cost of things as well. It's going to take a long time to train people up to the level that we need them at, and just doing it piecemeal, just saying, okay, we'll put them on a 2-day HHSRS course, and but we can't put them on the degree course or anything longer than that, is not really doing. It's not really. It's a false economy, really, because that person will come out of that. And I've interviewed people who are in that situation. Yeah, I've done the HHSRS course. I still don't know how to serve a notice. I don't know anything enough about construction. So when I go out and I look at it and I inspect a property and I can see there's damp and mold, so I don't understand enough to understand what structurally there needs to be done. And I need somebody to tell me, so you can shadow officers, and there's so there are people are shadowing experienced DHOs, but they're actually sort of at the stage in their career now where they're looking towards retirement. So it's just a matter of time before some of those people start to disappear, and they are disappearing already in some local authorities. So they don't have that kind of oracle person, the go-to person to be able to advise. So a lot of and then a lot of other officers are saying, well, we get told to just do our own research, self-directed learning on the internet, Google stuff. And okay, you might get, it depends what you look for as well. This is always something that you get warned about in universities about the quality of websites and things and things that you need to be looking at the right things. So that we've got very complicated issues that officers will encounter, and if you don't support them, they will leave. I've seen it happen. Local authority employed people, promised them that you'll do the HHSRS, will get you onto a university course, and then suddenly someone in HR says you can't, so you're blocked from being able to do that. And you've taken that person on already. They get fed up, they leave. And you can't blame them at all. So we really need to invest and support them, and understand that actually training that person up, retaining and recruiting good members of staff in the long term is going to be much better economically for the local authority. Other people you might get people because I think traditionally most of us came to the local authority with transferable skills. You don't often get many people who go straight from sixth form into an environmental health degree at university. Most of us, I remember most of us, we were all at a career change, and we all had things that we brought to the table. So it depends what you bring. I mean, if you're an ex-builder, then you probably you can probably do the HHSRS course and hit the ground running. But it really depends who you are and what you've got. If you're an estate agent, maybe a former estate agent, perhaps you probably know quite a lot about landlord and tenants liaison, and you're probably that's a really good skill set to have. But you still need to know how a house is built and what can go wrong with it. And, these are some of the most important things. So I think the apprenticeship idea, of course, is really taking off now. That obviously the big draw of that is obviously it's funded, so I can completely understand why people want to do that. But and the tailored apprenticeships for the tailored 18-month apprenticeships now that GMCA have done, it was a really good idea as well. And the thing about that what struck me there was it's not just one authority trying to upskill their own staff and just in a silo, without involving anyone else. It was across the whole region. And that was what was so good about it. And we need to think about that as well, because there was a time. I mean, definitely when I started, I did my degree, and I was doing my end on CIEH, examinations, the portfolio, and all the rest of it. And I went to another local authority, and they that was kind of almost expected that I do that, and they get somebody from somewhere else. And we had this kind of tacit agreement that we were kind of growing a profession. And that's what we really need to think about. It's not just about just filling the vacancies that we've got at the moment and coping with our workload. We've all got, across your whole region, you've got the same demands in different local authorities, and and on the services. But we need to be thinking about growing the profession more than just and having that holistic idea. So I got dismayed, really. Some people, and I do understand why they said it, but some managers were saying they got fed up with the fact that they train people, they invest in them, and then they suddenly disappear. and that's a real source of frustration. I know it's a good thing if you don't have a position for them to get to move into once they're trained, and they go off and go somewhere else and do it, and they're still within that profession. That's a good thing. You've done a good thing, and eventually they might come back. They might come back in a different role with lots more experience, or you might, so I think that's how we need to think about it.
It's about having a different outlook, isn't it? It's about you're
Mm.
investing in the profession, investing in the person and in the profession. And it was always normal that you would move around and people would
Yeah.
move around, and that was fine because somebody else would fill their spot. And I
Mm.
guess the the concern now, I suppose, from employers and authorities is there's not always somebody there with the skill set to fill that gap when someone leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah, traditionally it was part of development, wasn't it? And I think
Mm.
actually you do gain new skills and knowledge from moving somewhere else, a different type of housing stock and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
One of the points you made there about training is that gap that quite a lot of people talk about in terms of housing inspection and understanding the construction of a house. And you actually mentioned that sort of being a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
And I know that you started to try and plug that, with your resource. You've got like a booklet on housing construction. Is that the main area that came up as being the missing piece?
Yes, it was. I mean, the other things that some people said that some graduates, there was one manager said that they used to take them out on trips to building sites so they could understand about construction, because they don't appear to have covered it. Now, I found that a little bit strange because I definitely did cover it. We did quite a lot of that. I did a lot on food. I did a lot on all the other disciplines as well, and I did quite a lot on housing. So and I taught, and on the other side of it, teaching as well. I've taught quite a lot on housing and building and construction, and I created quite a lot of the content for the private sector housing intervention group course for Middlesex to do the 1 year course, and that was one of the things I said you really need to have. So I brought quite a lot of that together to put into that course, and it's been quite useful because the feedback is from people that I did teach on that course, is that it has helped them to progress. A couple of people have actually, actually went from being compliance officers to private sector housing officers. And it was because they aced the interviews because of all the stuff that they told me that they'd learned, which I was really delighted to hear. And now they're doing, and they're using that, and they're applying all that knowledge. And that was great. But the other thing I did, talking to compliance officers, is that they do the HHSRS course that they tell me, and then they don't use it in their job, because what they're doing is a different kind of job. They're going out and doing these compliance visits on selective licensed properties, or perhaps additional HMOs, and they're looking at they're looking at things that to comply with the license, and if there's anything serious, they're referring it up to senior officers. So a senior officer will theoretically come and do an HHSRS and deal with the serious problems that they've identified, but they don't get any feedback sometimes on what happens, on what the outcome is from that. And so once some of the officers were saying to me, I'd like to know, was I right? Was I right to say this is a category 1 hazard? Yeah. What then did that senior officer do? How did they risk score it? What notice did they serve? They don't get to hit the end point. And they said, and for their learning, that would be really useful. So it's this silo working again. We've got the compliance officers doing their thing, passing stuff on to the senior officers. Some of the senior officers, actually, what they say is, because they're inundated with this stuff, is that a lot of it they might use other types of notices, more expedient, because doing an HHSRS is more time consuming. So that they might do an EPA for expediency, or a drainage notice, or whatever it might be. So they don't actually do the HHSRS all the time, but that's not being fed back to the officers who referred it on. And so there's opportunities for learning that we're missing, that aren't actually going to cost the local government much at all. It costs time, maybe, but where's the harm in that? Where's the harm in just having a little meeting with your compliance officer, say, thank you very much for referring those over to me. This is what I did. and taking them
It's so
through it.
valuable. It's so
Yeah.
valuable, isn't it? You're learning from experienced colleagues and almost like a kind of mentorship. I
Mm.
remember sort of, one of the best people I've learned from was a fire officer who we had who used to spend a day in the office with the housing team. And you go out and do joint visits and you discuss cases in the office afterwards. And I learned so much from that. It's just so valuable.
Mm.
And if we're losing those experienced colleagues, then I think it is going to create a gap, isn't it? Which is going to be
Yeah.
hard to fill.
Yeah.
I'm going to move us on a little bit to talk about the profession
Okay.
as a whole. And one of the things you mentioned in your presentation was about us being the invisible profession because of our sort
Mm.
of upstream role in preventing health effects. And that actually we maybe didn't have the prominence of role that we should have done during COVID. How do we increase visibility and who can play a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite an interesting one, really. I mean, because it's always been the way, hasn't it? We are kind of victims of our own success when we prevent something from happening. It's like it never happened. And it is difficult, but we have to find ways to demonstrate the effectiveness of it. I'm really pleased to see that, but when I started this research, because it's taken a few years, there really wasn't, the CIEH has suddenly kind of stepped up a little bit, and they're now engaging with Parliament a bit more. They want to get this all-party parliamentary group together across working parties, looking at environmental health issues, which is really great. But that wasn't there when I started all of this. So, the invisibility was worse. But so that's one role that they can play. Of course, we're calling again for a chief environmental health officer, which we don't have, to sit alongside a chief medical officer. That would certainly be a very good marked progression if we could do something like that. But local authorities, we need to be able to demonstrate using data. And this is something that some local authorities are better at than others. I think those local authorities who have got licensing schemes, discretionary licensing schemes, and they've been running them for a while now, know a lot more about their local authorities than those that don't. And it's kind of a catch-22 because you need to understand quite a lot to make the case for licensing. But it's only when you actually start licensing that you get all the applications in, and you can look through and see how many selective licenses you've got, how many additional you've got, how what kind of portfolio holders have you got, and you understand more about the makeup of your private sector. Who is the what percentage are large portfolio holders? What's the percentage of just one-man bands, accidental landlords? And the majority of them, by the way, are sort of the ones who have one or maybe two properties, and the portfolio holders are fewer and far between, but they actually hold quite a lot of sway in local authorities who have quite a heavy demand to discharge their homeless duty very often. And so there are tensions sometimes, and this is what it's called policy capture. It's where large portfolio holders who are relied upon to house homelessness will sort of say, well, if you want me to carry on doing this, you need to ease off on the enforcement. And so some local authorities do that, and they bow to that pressure. And so you're in a situation where the person who's been regulated is able to influence local policy, and that's a problem. And so that undermines regulatory output, and that creates a kind of another layer of invisibility. That said, there are other things that we've done that we've shot ourselves in the foot with. I mean, obviously, the deregulation thing, that the cutting red tape that went on about a decade ago, that still had an impact. We went through this phase of the relaxation of planning laws allowed offices to be converted into living space, and then what that resulted in particularly in a few places in North London, was basements being converted into living space without sufficient ventilation. So you've got damp and mold, you've got inadequate ventilation, you've probably got excess heat in there as well, overcrowding as well. And these actual spaces were not designed for living in. And so on the one hand, you've got the council saying it's okay for you to use these for living spaces, to telling landlords you can put tenants in there. And on the other hand, you've got private sector housing coming in there, crashing the party, serving notices or prohibition orders or whatever because of these issues. So you've got the left hand and the right hand were doing two different things, and that caused quite a few problems. The message that sends to landlords is a very confused one. And landlords, of course, the other thing is where their portfolios don't just confine themselves to one borough. They will just buy their properties wherever, and wherever they go, they're being regulated in different ways, which is very, which can be difficult depending on the political outlook in that local authority. And if you so you could have these things. You have these things called just sort of known lines of argument that we have. So we all know, for example, we all repeat that, addressing housing in it, how using housing regulation will reduce inequalities in health. And we all know this, we all talk about it a lot. But some local authorities, you can say that, yeah, that's great, but can you show me in numbers, in data, how you've done that in your own local authority? And then they can't. And they can't because they're not actually doing it in that way. Now, the one of the problems is that to look at health outcomes takes some time for that to emerge through if you're doing things like discretionary licensing. So a 5-year licensing scheme is not long enough to be able to look at those health outcomes and make those inferences. And it's not, you can't really join the dots literally. You have to just look at how much regulation you're doing and what's going on at an ecological level to do with health in your borough, and you can see whether you're seeing a decrease in certain health issues. But it's understanding how to articulate all of that and how to present that data. Because if you go to public health and you want to do some joint up working with public health and the NHS, that they work with data, they work with quantifiable data, qualitative and quantitative data, and they will do it at a statistical level. And if you just say to them, okay, we're doing this regulation, and you show them a load of outputs, enforcement outputs, how many notices you served, and how many properties you visited, or whatever it might be, it's not showing them a health outcome. And so they have to. There's quite a lot of work that has to be done. And if you're just doing it informally, you've got nothing to measure. So it becomes very difficult to be able to try to make those things work. And for local authorities that suddenly want to make that change to from informal regulation to formal regulation, it's a cultural change within a local authority. And then suddenly you're saying you want a discretionary licensing scheme. You don't have years of data of regulatory output to show how bad the situation is in your local authority, although you know it because you're out there all the time. You might have been informally regulating these landlords for a long time. You're not getting anywhere with it, but it's very, very difficult to show it. But in local authorities who've made those designations, and they've said, we're serving so many notices, we've got so much disrepair, we've got so much damp and mold, so much excess cold, so much overcrowding, so much fire safety issues in these properties. It's just, and there are the actual problems with Part 1 regulation, for example. As soon as you serve a notice, it can be suspended, and when it's appealed. And so that takes a long time for it to go, for that process to go through, and all the while those tenants are being exposed to hazards even longer. That was one of the strong arguments that some local authorities made for going over to licensing regulation because of the inherent problems with Part 1 of the Housing Act. So, but they had the key to that is, of course, you've got data to show, to explain you know, what's going on, and you can show where the worst areas are in your local authority, because it's all recorded somehow. But where you don't have that, you've got a real problem. And sometimes what's underlying it is our political external influences outside of the control of your private sector housing manager.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great kind of overview of that. Thinking about the people that are, you know, kind of doing that work. We had kind of two viewpoints coming over, not quite opposing viewpoints, but maybe like groups with slightly different interests. Sort of, there was some comments around thinking about that environmental health, that kind of wider viewpoint, and is there a risk that that could disappear from housing enforcement to be replaced with officers who are solely trained in housing enforcement? But on the other hand, there's lots of actually very experienced professionals in housing who aren't officially EHPs, but have a lot of experience in housing. And in some local authorities, they might be barred from progressing, actually. And then they do end up moving on because they can't actually kind of move up the ladder because they're not an EHO. So there's kind of two different points of view to balance, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, from a management point of view, you've got to think about it this way: that you've got a lot of people that you're managing, and some people are just quite happy to just stay where they are, you know, for whatever reason, and that's absolutely fine. And you're absolutely right. You know, people who are not EHOs can do a great job in housing, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. They've got a lot of experience. Others might just want to sort of just stay at one level, perhaps it's work-life balance maybe, or they just think, I'm just not academically minded, but you know, I know what I've got to do and I'll do it. And they're very laser focused and they do a good job, and we should value them as well. But if they want to progress and they're encountering a barrier to progression, that's not, you know, that is literally just something to do within the local authority that's just saying, no, we don't want that. We are really shooting ourselves in the foot. You know, the CIH used to be criticised, I think, when I started out. They, you know, you heard this phrase a lot. Oh, it's an old boys club, but I don't think we hear that much anymore. At least I don't. And the reason I think we don't hear, I think it's more diverse now. And I've always been, I always felt my always feeling about it was, you know, it'll never unless more people get into the profession who want to change it, then it won't change. You know, you need that to be able to change it. And it's opened up a lot. You know, there's been a lot of changes since I started as well. We've now got more avenues, more pathways into the profession through different, you know, through different ways, you know, depending on you know, your level of expertise and what you bring to the table. So, which is something I tried to show in the talk. So it has broadened. Could it do more? Yeah, of course it could. I think we always could. We could always improve more. But you know, I think if people really want to progress, it's a really important thing. One of the things, really sad thing, really felt for some of the people that I interviewed, who had actually self-funded their degrees, and they got through, and now they want to go and do the chartered program, but their employers won't pay for it, and they can't afford to because they're saddled with debt now because they've done their degree, you know, and obviously there's the work-life balance thing as well, and so that they can't go any further forward. And then one of the awful things, the sad thing I heard was from another manager, is that the truth was that they didn't want their graduates to progress any further because there is no further further promotion opportunities for promotion in the structure that they've got. So the chances are, if that you then become a chartered EHP and you want more money, you're going to go somewhere else, and then you've got that whole thing. We've invested in you, and now you're disappearing, and you've got that kind of, I don't want to say mean-spiritedness, but you know, you've got that kind of forgetting that we're trying to grow a profession, and that to me, that again, I felt that was rather sad. So Yeah, it is very difficult, but I think if people want to progress, we shouldn't be stopping their ambition. We really shouldn't be, because that's, that they are potentially tomorrow's leaders. And that was my question to everybody at the end. Who do you want tomorrow's leaders to be? And, how do we support them to get there? Who do you want
That's
to be
it. And
taking over from you?
yeah, and if you stifle people, they're going to leave anyway, aren't they?
Yeah.
Mm,
If they haven't got that kind of that job satisfaction. I was just looking at the people we had on the call for the round table, and I think around 95% work for local authorities.
yeah,
Um, Working within private sector housing, it was, a good range. They had lots of experience, 10 years, 20 years plus. But only 9% were housing managers. Um,
Mm.
okay.
which well, I'm not sure what that tells us, but out of say 75% worked within private sector housing enforcement, 9% were managers, and then we had some in other roles. So it was interesting. Really, loads and loads of experience there.
Yeah.
But maybe, yeah, yeah. I think you need that level of progression, don't you, to be happy and get job
Mm,
satisfaction and to want to stay within the profession.
yeah.
Um,
And I think this is the conversation we need to have. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, actually, when you think about sort of not being happy in your role, that's another one of the points that was raised is that can get you to the point of view where you are not performing effectively. Actually, maybe you start to lose your empathy because you're so unhappy in the role. And actually, a huge part of what we do, you need that empathy, don't you? You need to
Yeah,
care about the people that you're out there helping.
I
yeah.
think that was
I mean
really
that.
interesting, Ali, wasn't it? Yeah, sorry that a few people mentioned during the round table, it's not so much about skill and knowledge, it's about what about when you lose that empathy.
Yeah.
But
Mm,
yeah, don't know what you think about that, Paul.
very. That's a very interesting point. Some of the people I spoke to, some of the people that are quite experienced, did talk about that. Did talk about how early on in their careers they probably did make some wrong decisions, and they had learning curves to do with empathy. I mean, one person was sort of saying that they had their own worldview and their own opinions, and they felt that they couldn't understand why why tenants sometimes can't make end up making poor choices.
Mm.
Why did you take, this property's riddled with damp and mold, and the heating doesn't work. What made you want to come and live here? Yeah. Um, but they don't understand that the choices that tenants are restricted by sometimes, because they've had their life experience is completely different to yours. You've been lucky. This person said, I'm quite when I think about, I'm quite lucky. They'd obviously got their degree. They're well educated. They had a good upbringing. But whereas some of the people that they're dealing with are in vulnerable, terrible, unenviable situations, and they've got much really tragic, heartbreaking backstories, probably, as to why they've ended up where they are. And
Be a
so
real lack of choice, can't it? A real lack of
yeah,
choice and options.
yeah, and it's still not, and having not having empathy is, it's something that somebody else said in one of the focus groups. They said that, I think as a nation we're losing our empathy.
Mm.
And I think if you look back at some of the things that have been going on lately, with demonstrations with flags going everywhere, and the reasons behind it, I can kind of see that they've got a point. We've got a very, very large focus on an issue which is, in the grand scheme of all the other issues that we've got in this country, is quite small. But it's very easy to place a blame on people, and it's kind of that, it's a macrocosm version of not having, not having empathy, because it's one of the lessons from Grenfell. And I guess it's one of the lessons also with regards to the Awabi shark tragedy as well. It was lack of empathy, which social housing providers were criticised for. At Grenfell, it was, to be frank, it was racism. People they just looked down on the tenants. People had these concerns and about the cladding, and they were just being fobbed off. And that's what the inquiry has revealed. And so now, this is why I introduced that McGill paper, because I think it's such an important paper for social housing, is that they now have to retrain their managers. They have to retrain their frontline staff, and they to be able to have empathy and to be able to reflect. And so I looked at that and I thought, well, where did I learn about all of that? Well, I learned about all of that at university. And then where did I put it into practice? Well, I put it into practice doing my environmental health portfolio, because reflection was where you got the biggest marks. And why were they encouraging me to do that? So that I would be somebody who could go out and have empathy, reflect on what I'm doing, and try to, in a way, try to, become, develop my professionalism individually, and also with my CPD, and to be able to prove my competency. And so we've got that inbuilt into our profession. It's a very, very important thing. And if we were to just go along and just employ people and not give them the opportunity to progress that way, we're going to lose all of that. And so social housing are going to be ahead of the game, and we're going to be back to where they are now if we're not careful. That's one of the things. The other thing, actually, that occurred to me listening to members. I spoke to people who are CIEH members, people who aren't, people who want to be, but they're being held back. But some of the CIEH members were saying that they felt that it hadn't really helped them in their career progression, which was an interesting point. They did say that having the post-nominal letters did open things up for them in terms of the respect you get when you go to court. It's accepted, and your evidence is much more accepted because you are an expert. That was something. Certainly when you serve notices, having the letters, having that expertise as well, change things. And that's something I certainly found as well when the letters were added to my name, and I was enforcing. I found that was quite useful. But the question of, did it help you to progress, was quite interesting, because if you mean by that, just by having those letters after your name, the door is going to open for you straight away, and you're going to move in, then that's shades of the old boys club, isn't it? Just, nod and a wink, and in you go. It doesn't work like that, and it shouldn't work like that. But if we are doing CPD and we are developing our knowledge, continuing and professionalizing, then in a roundabout way, if you go for a job interview and you answer all the questions, you ace those questions, and you get that job and you get that promotion, it is your accumulated knowledge that is helping you to progress. And how did you get that knowledge? Well, it's because you're keeping up your CPD. It's because you're learning and you're keeping up that lifelong learning. So yes, in a way, the CIEH having that professionalism does help you to progress, although not in the way that you might, in a way that's immediately obvious.
Yeah. I'm going to finish off with a final thought for the future. In your conclusions, you talked about thinking beyond the confines of your own regulatory authority. What do you think that means to you? And does local government reorganisation play a role there? Does the CIEH play a role there? As you've said.
There's a massive, there's lots on the horizon with that. I mean, with renters' rights as well. The idea that you can go and, that one authority can go and regulate in another authority. That is, again, we've seen that model in other iterations of environmental health, but it's now coming through with the renters' rights. It is quite important because we are all sometimes sharing the same problem, landlords, across our local authorities, and we need to communicate better about that. That's important. The other thing is, of course, yes, we've got the devolution, and we've got the changes with local authorities, and we're going to amalgamate. So perhaps maybe that will get rid of some of this idea about people disappearing and being trained up, because there might be room for them to go somewhere else. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. The reality is that it probably might end up being a group of people doing more work across wider areas. That's also a possibility. I hope not. But then it's developing those models. The renters' rights, of course, is going to be very, very, very reliant on having that property database up and running. Without that, it's not really it's not really going to work very well. But having a property database where we can all see what's going on there, and so if we want to check out a problem landlord and see where, you know, what the extent of his portfolio, and then we want to have discussions with other local authorities, then, you know, that might facilitate a bit of cross boundary regulation, I suppose. But yeah, but it's thinking. It might encourage a culture where we start to think more outside our silo, outside the confinement of our own local authority, and start to think about it in a more holistic way, which is the way we should have been doing it all along anyway. And in a way, it's a kind of it's almost a battle that a tension that we have with fragmentation, reorganization from environmental health to regulatory services, or, you know, or private sector housing, or, you know, whatever labels and banding that we've got with this thing. The science doesn't change. The inspection methods don't change. The legislation changes, but the reasons why we take action don't change either, and it shouldn't, you know, and it shouldn't alter the way we think about ourselves in a profession. Yes, we work in local government, but we're also part of this wider profession as well, and we're bound by ethics, which is going to be quite important as well, I think, if political changes go the way that everyone's predicting at the moment, because we're already dealing with councillors from traditional parties who have a layperson's view, and we're trying to manage those expectations. We might have more extreme councillors to deal with, you know, in coming up with on the horizon, and we're dealing with vulnerable people, and they may well be the type of vulnerable people that councillor doesn't want in that local authority. A very unpleasant thought, but a very disturbing one, a very worrying one. But we are ethically bound to help people, and so there may be a large conversation that we might need to have as well if things go that way. Hopefully they won't, but you know, we just don't know. But, you know, but we shouldn't change. You know, in some ways we need to adapt and change to things, but there are certain things, that principles that are lines in the sand that we shouldn't compromise.
Yeah, they're talking to each other, they're learning from best practice and from each other. I mean, I can only hope that those barriers are going to come down more,
Mm.
because they'll kind of have to if we're going to implement the Renters' Rights Bill properly, and for the profession to continue. But yeah, learning from each other is just so important. I've worked for some authorities where that's brilliant. There's regional working is absolutely excellent. I've worked for some others where you just don't do it,
Mm.
and yeah, it's really disappointing to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, but I think when I first made my first move from one local authority to another, I thought it was going to be exactly the same, and I was so shocked, you know. And you don't realise, but then of course at university, you know, you think about, well, you talk about the needs and wants of places. You know, you move from a town to a city, it's going to be different. Of course it is, you know, and the history of it as well, and how it was built, and if it's a new town, or if it's, you know, compared to an older, more traditional type of housing stock, then it's going to be very different. But then politically, as I said, the approach is, it's all how it's politically driven. And if we're and if leaders who need to frame the problems politically are relying on local authorities' data to be able to understand what's going on, it needs to be accurate. And sometimes things can creep in that aren't accurate, and this is what you know, accepted lines of argument can get distorted when you get policy capture. So this is what I was saying before. You know, you socially construct the narrative. You know, the narrative, you can socially construct a narrative, to looking at the extreme example at the moment, where you can blame everything on migration, and that's a social construction. That argument breaks down in so many different ways. Don't want to talk, that's really slightly off the subject, but you can socially construct an environment whereby you're saying that the problem is that you've got a duty to house, and you've got so many homeless applications, and lots of people are homeless, and we need the help of landlords to you know, to house them and satisfy that duty. Or you could socially construct to say, yes, there are lots of people being made homeless because of retaliatory eviction, because they are complaining about the conditions in their properties. And so it's actually the fact that we need to be tackling the worst landlords to be able to deal with that, and to be able to allow people to remain in those properties and work with them to ensure that they're not harassed and they're not illegally evicted, or that we can use protections under the Deregulation Act, limited as they are to only 6 months at the moment. But then, of course, the renters' rights is going to hopefully change that as well, and that might change the narrative, hopefully, in local authorities, and how we socially construct our landscapes.
I think it'd be interesting to have another conversation after the Renters' Rights Act is in, maybe about how that has changed, and whether that has changed in the way we want it to.
Yeah, bed in a bit.
Few years down the line.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I've forgotten what I've said.
Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we've managed to cover all of the unanswered points that we had, so it's been really beneficial, and I'm sure people will really enjoy listening to this. So I'm just going to finish on a final note. Our next Housing Roundtable is scheduled for Tuesday the 2nd of December, and our next guest speaker will be Professor John Edwards, talking about damp and mould in buildings. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.